So yeah, I was wondering about the move of people to an online life. I think that it's increasingly the case that people live online. I think it's a great thing. However, one of the obstacles of democracy is that you have to drive to a place to vote still. Would you be in favor of electronic vote from home?
Well, the only reason I'm concerned with that is because people like Zuckerberg have been advocating it. Let's move to a 100% home-based polling. And as we know, there were all sorts of. I was working with Paul Nehlen without knowing it on election night, helping to reveal voter fraud in Philadelphia. Paul Nehlen was actually leading that effort under his handle, which he can share that if he wants on WeSearcher. And it's a lot easier to fudge things electronically than it is with a real electronic paper trail where real people show up with real IDs. We know that the Israeli government has ring zero access to all of the, I think it's the x86 architecture, pretty much any of the chips from the 80s and beyond, with a few exceptions, including some chips being made in Russia. They have ring zero access baked into all of it. And ever since the Pentium 4 with the Intels, they have ring zero access. So if they want they want to connect to any computer that's connected to the internet that's got a Pentium 4 or later, they have access. So, I mean, one of the biggest themes I've been hitting on is really interference in our elections. And if we make everything electronic and digital, we have to look at why Russia has actually stripped computer systems out of a lot of their nuclear submarines and out of a lot of their electronic power management stations and substations in Russia, because they know this stuff is a delicate digital infrastructure, and it's a critical thing, the voting process. If we make that all digital, while at the same time Russia said, "Oh my God, the Israelis can shut anything down at any time if it's connected on the web," and they're returning the analog transistors and stuff and their power plants and stuff for managing the regulation of wattage and voltage and stuff. So if they're doing that because they're afraid of Israeli hacking into the lowest level of your computer at like the machine code level, do we really want to make it so that it's not just AIPAC buying our politicians and PACs and all that stuff, and make it so they can just, oh, we don't need to spend as much money on buying politicians now. We can just hack into the computers and no one's going to know because we can also hack the computers that have the logs on them. So no, it's a terrible idea. I'm 100% against moving to digital voting. 100% of vote against.
All right, you just convinced me. Personally, on principle, I would love people to be able to express themselves from home, but you did convince me that it may be very dangerous. There's really no way to check in the end. Just like there were cases of voting machines that seem to have been reporting some very wrong results. We wouldn't want this to happen at a national level.
And I'm not even sure if I'm a fan of postal ballots. Are you familiar with may I go on a brief segue about an election that was stolen in Austria?
I'd like to hear about it.
Okay, so in May of 2016, there was a candidate, FPÖ. His name was Hofer. Are you familiar with Mr. Hofer?
No.
This was one of the greatest election thefts in history. How could you not?
I'm not an historian, I'm a biologist. I could do surgery on him, but I don't know about him.
Well, history is important, and I'll just say this real quick in 10 seconds. The reason I've chosen the patterns and the methods and tactics and strategies I'm choosing now to battle these Jewish supremacists is because of my understanding of history. But I've studied, when I woke up to the Jewish question, I spent about 9 months reading history, real history, which I advise everyone to do that wants to go into politics. You recognize patterns, and that's how you beat systems. Anyhow, back to Hofer in Austria. In May of 2016, Hofer won by a landslide by like 1 or 2% of the vote compared to. Anyhow, he won by a good margin considering how taboo his policies were. He had 51 or 52% of the vote. And everyone went to bed saying, okay, the exit polls are showing, and also the vote tally so far showing Hofer is winning by a good margin. The next morning we wake up, and suddenly flags are going off across the country. Oh my God, I think it was Niederösterreich, one of the provinces of Austria, reported 147% voter participation. Suddenly Hofer only had 49% of the vote, and voter participation had gone from 80% when suddenly, like 90% of the new votes counted were these postal ballots that appeared out of thin air and not through the postal service. And the judge said, oh my, this is incredible. We've got, just a second. We've got looks like there was voter fraud. Looks like this election where Hofer appeared to be winning was just all rigged and stuff in the first place, when the voter participation went up to 147% out of a possible 100%, which even theoretically, given random probability and things that can happen, 100% is pretty much impossible too, unless you have a population of like 10 people. And so instead of saying, okay, we'll have a recount and figure out who committed the fraud and investigating who committed this massive fraud and the stuffing of the ballots for the postal ballots against Hofer, they said, well, we'll just recall a new election. And then the whole propaganda machine of all of the media, all the newspapers went into full mode, 4 or 6 months of just saying, Hofer is this, Hofer is bad, just associative conditioning. And then Hofer lost the new election. But they never investigated who was behind the stuffing of the ballot boxes that made Hofer go from 51 or 52% down to 48 or 49%. They say in German, 147% Wahlbeteiligung gibt's nicht. There's no such thing as 147% voter participation. So any type of remote voting, even by mail, I question how, unless I think that all people should show up, present an ID, and that ID should be verified. And then you go have your secret ballot. But access to the ballot booth must be controlled. Physical presence. I'm 100% against postal voting. But if it's available, use it. But I'm against in principle there being it. And that is even worse would be digital voting. And you have people like Zuckerberg who censors all of the dissenting opinions against Israel. That are plugging constantly this digital voting. So while it sounds very convenient, look then at the cons. The pro is convenient. The con is Israelis have access just to about every computer, and we know Israelis are the top interferers in elections around the globe.
It's very worrying when you look at the number of stories about dead people voting, about the mechanism behind voting machines, electronic machines. I can't imagine. There must be a certain percentage of democratic elections that have been completely stolen in the history of humanity, and it's very worrying indeed.
Well, and that's why I'm for making it so there's integrity in the system again. Not only is it just controlling whether or not someone who's allowed to vote is actually voting, not only is it making it so that California stops busing in illegals to vote and stops having ID laws to prove that they're citizens. Not only is it that, it's also getting rid of corporate and Jewish lobby money from Israel, which is really just so we give them billions of dollars a year, and like a half or 1/3 of it comes back to flow into private politicians. So we give them the money to buy our government with, and then they get to keep about half of it for themselves. And even corporations. In my platform, I say no political action committees, no corporate donations, no lobbies unless that lobby is a nonprofit for one or more of the 10 rights that are enumerated in the Bill of Rights.